The Defense Dispatch.
She'd labeled him a threat to democracy. He offered the kind of smile you'd see on a man who'd spent 7 years defending killers, right before he started prosecuting terrorists. Then he unlatched his leather briefcase. Inside held the weight of 60 jury trials, $1 billion in fraud cases, and 3 marriages that remained a complete mystery to everyone. Room 2154 of the Rayburn House office building wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for confrontation. The dais sits elevated, a long curved bench of dark wood, allowing members of Congress to literally look down on the witness table below. This architecture is entirely intentional. It sends a clear message. We are above you, and you are here to answer to us. On this particular January morning, the room was packed in a way it hadn't been for years. The gallery, with its 300 seats arranged in rows behind the witness table, held a cross-section of America that you couldn't have even imagined a generation ago. On the left side sat families from the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, home to the largest Somali American community in the United States. Many of the women wore hijabs, many of the men wore kofi caps, and they all sat upright with a dignified tension, knowing that whatever happened in this room would shape how the rest of the country saw them. On the right side was a completely different crowd: advocates, auditors, and there was a handful of parents who had driven all the way from Minnesota to Washington because they'd learned from news reports and court documents that federal money meant to feed their own children had instead paid for lakefront properties, luxury cars, and first-class plane tickets to the Maldives. In the no-man's land of the center aisle, caught between these two groups, sat the press. Cameras mounted on tripods, boom mics on extended arms, and the little red recording lights of C-SPAN glowing like small, patient eyes. The witness arrived at 8:45, a full 15 minutes early. Kashyap Pramod Patel, or Cash, as the world knew him, walked into room 2154. He entered the same way he'd walked into courtrooms for 2 decades, alone, carrying a single briefcase, and wearing a suit that fit perfectly but didn't scream for attention. There was no entourage, no deputy director at his side, no communications staff whispering last-minute talking points in his ear. It was just him and his leather case, the very same way he'd entered courtrooms back in Miami-Dade County, Florida, as a 26-year-old defending people the state was trying to lock away for life. Now, he was 45 years old and the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the 9th person to ever hold the title, and the very first of South Asian descent. His hair was dark and close-cropped. His jaw was clean-shaven. His eyes were a shade of brown that looked warm in a casual chat, but turned into something much colder under the fluorescent lights of a room like this, right when the questions started. He placed the briefcase on the witness table. He poured himself a glass of water. He then sat down and placed his hands flat on the table. This was a habit he'd picked up from his public defender days, when he learned that juries trust witnesses they can see the hands of and distrust the ones who hide them. The committee members started to filter in. The Republicans came in first, then the Democrats, and finally the chairman, a Republican from Kentucky who had built his entire career on investigating other people's money and approached the job with the excitement of a bloodhound that's just caught a fresh scent. The vice chair, a Democrat from Maryland, sat to his left, arranging her papers with the careful neutrality of someone who already knew this morning was going to be unpleasant for her party. The very last member to take her seat was Representative Ilhan Omar. She came in through a side door reserved just for committee members, a small perk of institutional power that put her closer to the dais and farther from the gallery, almost as if the room's design itself was meant to separate her from the people she represented. She was wearing a deep purple hijab and a dark blazer. She walked with confidence. It was the walk of a woman who had survived a refugee camp in Kenya, won an election to Congress as the first Somali American in history, been featured on the cover of Time magazine, condemned by her own party, removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee, investigated by the House Ethics Office, and still emerged from every single crisis with her seat intact and her voice undiminished. She took her place on the dais. She shot a glance at Patel. It was a brief, evaluative look, the kind a politician gives when they're sizing someone up, trying to figure out if they're an obstacle or an opportunity. Patel met her gaze. His expression didn't change one bit. His hands stayed flat on the table. The chairman gavelled the hearing to order. This morning, the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform continues its investigation into the fraud and misuse of federal funds within the state of Minnesota. Our witness is the Honorable Kash Patel, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director Patel, thank you for being here. The chair now recognizes Representative Omar for the first round of questioning. Omar leaned into her microphone. When she spoke, her voice had that special kind of clarity that comes from a person who has spent their entire adult life fighting to be heard. First in refugee communities, then in the Minnesota State Legislature, and now in the United States Congress. Director Patel, many people in the community I represent feel this investigation is politically motivated, that it's targeting the Somali American community just to serve the president's agenda. So, before we move on, can you promise this committee that the FBI will conduct this investigation fairly, without any bias, and without the kind of racial profiling my constituents are afraid of? It was a powerful opening move. She was setting the frame for the entire discussion. She didn't want this to be about fraud, but about fairness. Not about evidence, but about identity. Her question basically said, this investigation is about race, and anyone who supports it is complicit. Patel took a slow sip of water. He set the glass back down. When he spoke, his voice was measured, not in the way a politician carefully chooses their words, but in the way a trial lawyer has learned that the most effective sentences are often the shortest. Congresswoman, I started my career as a public defender down in Miami-Dade County, Florida. I spent 7 years defending the very people the system wanted to just throw away. We're talking murderers, drug traffickers, people who couldn't afford a lawyer and were just assigned one by the court. Me, I defended their constitutional rights because, in America, even the person accused of the worst crimes still deserves a defense. He paused for just a beat. It was the kind of beat a lawyer uses to let a sentence sink in before delivering the next line. So when I tell you this investigation will be fair, I know exactly what that word means. I've lived it from the other side of the courtroom. He paused again, but this time it was shorter. But fair also means that no one is above the law, including members of Congress. The whole feeling in the room shifted, not in a way you could see. No one moved, no one gasped, no one even murmured. But the air itself changed, the way it does right before a big storm hits. It's when the pressure drops. The birds go silent, and anyone who's lived through that kind of weather knows exactly what's coming next. Omar's eyes narrowed just a fraction. It was that tiny fraction that separates a politician who's in control from one who has just realized the witness isn't going to play the part they wrote for him. But Omar recovered quickly. She was, whatever else you could say about her, a survivor. And survivors don't lose their composure over one single exchange. She'd survived a civil war, a refugee camp, a hostile political environment, and the constant attention of a president who had told her on national television to go back where she came from. A witness with a sharp tongue wasn't about to rattle her. She leaned back towards the microphone. "Director Patel, let me just ask you directly. The majority of the defendants in this Feeding Our Future case are Somali Americans. The president has called Somali immigrants, and I quote, garbage. He's even suggested they contribute nothing. Do you truly believe this investigation is being conducted without any racial bias? It was a trap, and a very well-laid one at that. If Patel said yes, she'd accuse him of ignoring racial profiling. If he said no, she'd use his own words against the administration. Either way, the headlines would be about race, not about fraud. But Patel didn't walk through either of those doors. Instead, he opened a third one. "Congresswoman, I'm the son of Indian immigrants from Uganda. My father, Pramod Patel, was born in East Africa to a family of Gujarati descent. In 1972, the dictator Idi Amin ordered the expulsion of all people of Asian origin from Uganda. In 90 days, my father's family lost everything: their home, their business, their entire community. They were kicked out simply because of the color of their skin." He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. "My family came to America with absolutely nothing. They rebuilt their lives from scratch on Long Island, New York. My father became a financial officer. My mother raised a family. They gave me every single opportunity this country has to offer. An education, freedom, the chance to become a public defender, then a terrorism prosecutor, and now the director of the FBI." His voice never rose. It didn't sharpen. It just continued on, with the steadiness of a man who's simply stating facts that don't need any extra flair. "So please do not lecture me about the pain of immigration. Congresswoman, I've lived it. My family has lived it. And we came here legally, built our lives honestly, and never once asked for any special treatment." He paused. And then, like a trial lawyer shifting gears from an opening statement to a direct examination, he completely changed direction. "But since you brought up the subject of the immigrant community, I'd actually like to ask you about your own immigration record." Omar's jaw tightened. "That is not relevant to this hearing. Congresswoman, you asked me about the fairness of this investigation. I'm answering your question. You asked for accountability. So let's start with yours." He opened the briefcase. He pulled out a thin, organized folder, tabbed with colored markers. It was the kind of folder you'd see from a lawyer who has meticulously prepared a case. "In 2002, you entered into a religious marriage, a faith ceremony, not a legal one, with a man named Ahmed Hersi. You had 3 children together. Then, in 2009, while you were still in that relationship with Mr. Hersi, you entered into a legal marriage, filed with the state, with a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi." He turned a page in the folder. "Mr. Elmi held British citizenship. After the marriage, he enrolled at North Dakota State University, your alma mater. He graduated in 2012. He then moved to Minneapolis, where public records show he lived in a public housing complex before he was evicted. After that, he returned to the United Kingdom." Patel turned another page. "In 2011, you and Mr. Elmi separated, but you didn't legally divorce until 2017, a full 6 years later. During that 6-year period, specifically in 2014 and 2015, you filed joint federal tax returns with Mr. Hersi, the man you were living with, all while you were still legally married to Mr. Elmi. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board even confirmed this violation. You paid a $500 fine and subsequently filed amended returns." He closed the folder, but he didn't set it down. He held it. "Congresswoman, I just have one question. How many siblings do you have?" The question landed like a stone dropped into perfectly still water. It was simple. It was direct. And Omar's response to it, or really her failure to respond, would tell everyone in the room everything they needed to know. That is a conspiracy theory that has been debunked. Congresswoman, I didn't ask you about conspiracy theories. I asked how many siblings you have. It's a factual question. It has a factual answer, a number. I am the youngest of 7. And is Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi one of those 7? He is not my brother. That is a baseless. Then just provide the birth certificates and we can clear this up immediately. You have been asked this exact question for 10 years by journalists, by investigators, by the House Ethics Office. And for 10 years, you have refused to provide the documentation. You have refused to make your family available to reporters. You have refused to release your immigration records. He set the folder down on the table. Congresswoman, in my years as a public defender, I represented hundreds of clients. And in that time, I learned something that every single criminal defense lawyer learns. Innocent people want to prove their innocence. They bring you documents. They bring you witnesses. They bring you evidence. Only people who have something to hide choose to remain silent. Omar leaned forward. Her voice rose, not to a shout, but to the pitch of genuine indignation, which is a totally different thing from performed indignation and carries a completely different kind of energy. You are attacking me because I am a black Muslim woman. Patel's voice didn't rise to meet hers. It stayed exactly where it was, low, calm, and precise. My father was expelled from Uganda because of the color of his skin. He's Indian African. I am a Hindu serving as the FBI director, a position that 100 years ago would never have been given to someone who looks like me. I celebrate Diwali in a building named after J. Edgar Hoover. He held her gaze. Do not play the victim card with me. It will not work. The gallery was completely silent. It was the kind of silence that falls over a room when a weapon has just been used. Not a loud weapon, not a dramatic one, but a precise one. The kind that leaves a clean wound. The chairman glanced at the clock. Only 26 minutes had passed. In a normal oversight hearing, 26 minutes would have barely covered the opening statements and maybe the start of the first round of questions. But today, 26 minutes had been enough time to bring up immigration records, tax filings, marriage timelines, and the pointed silence of a congresswoman who had refused for a decade to answer a question that could be settled with a single piece of paper. Omar hadn't spoken for 8 seconds. 8 seconds isn't normally a long time. But in a congressional hearing, with the cameras rolling and C-SPAN broadcasting to every screen in every congressional office, every newsroom, and every living room where someone had tuned in, 8 seconds was a lifetime. She finally filled the silence. She was far too experienced to just leave dead air. Director Patel, let me redirect this conversation back to the actual subject of today's hearing. The FBI, under your leadership, has been described by career agents as politicized and weaponized. Multiple whistleblowers have come forward. Congresswoman, Patel's voice cut through, the 2 words closing a door, gently, but firmly and completely. Let me rephrase. You want to talk about accountability at the FBI? Wonderful. Let's talk about accountability. Let's start with $2,780,000. He pulled a second folder from his briefcase. In 2020, you married Tim Minett, a political consultant. Mr. Minett is the principal of a firm called the E Street Group. During your 2020 re-election campaign, the E Street Group received $2,780,000 in contracts directly from your campaign. The payments were listed for digital advertising, fundraising consulting, mail production, and postage. He let the number hang in the air. $2,780,000 from a congressional campaign to the campaign manager's firm, who just so happened to be the candidate's husband. An FEC complaint was filed. Your campaign then terminated its contract with Mr. Minette's firm in November of 2020, after the election, and after the money had already been paid. Your campaign released a statement saying the termination was to, and I quote, ensure there was no perceived issue. Perceived, Congresswoman. Not actual perceived. He turned a page. Before you married Mr. Minette, were you aware that his previous wife stated in their divorce filings that her marriage ended because of Mr. Minette's affair with you? Omar's staff, sitting behind her on the dais, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The movement was small, but you could see it. It was the involuntary flinch of people who know exactly where a line of questioning is going, and know there's nothing they can do to stop it. My personal life is not. $2,780,000 of campaign donor money went to your husband's firm. Your personal life became your donor's business the moment you signed those checks. He turned another page. His voice shifted again, not louder, but colder. It was the shift from a lawyer conducting an examination to a lawyer presenting hard evidence. Let me show you something. In 2023, your Congressional Financial Disclosure Form listed total assets and income consistent with a net worth of approximately $158,000. You also disclosed credit card and student loan debt somewhere between $45,000 and $150,000. He paused. 1 year later, in 2024, your financial disclosure listed your husband's stake in a venture capital firm called Rose Lake Capital at a value between $5 million and $25 million. His stake in a California winery called Estes Cru was listed at between $1 million and $5 million. He set both sheets of paper side by side on the table. From $158,000 to potentially $30 million in just 12 months. He looked up at the committee. House Oversight Chairman Comer said, and I am quoting here, "It is not possible. I am a money guy. It is not possible." He looked back at Omar. Congresswoman, Rose Lake Capital's bank account contained 5 cents in 2023. 5 cents. The very next year, the company was valued at up to $25 million. Mr. Minette's other company, the winery, is currently the subject of a fraud lawsuit filed by an investor named Naeem Uddin, who alleges he was promised a $200,000 return on a $300,000 investment and received absolutely nothing. He closed the folder. And I should also note, because this detail is relevant to the question of character, not the legal question, that your husband operates a winery, a business that produces and sells alcohol. You are a devout Muslim. Islam prohibits the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol. Now, I would never question anyone's personal faith. That's between a person and their God. But when you use your faith as a political shield, while your own husband profits from a product that your faith forbids, that's not just hypocrisy, Congresswoman. He paused, and his voice dropped to its lowest register. That's a business model. A sound rippled through the gallery. Not quite laughter, but the sound of a collective, compressed exhale from people who just heard something they were all thinking, but would never have dared to say out loud. The chairman tapped his gavel just once, not hard, but just enough to restore order. Omar sat motionless behind her nameplate. Her hands were still, her face was composed, but her eyes, and this is the thing about eyes, the thing that cameras always catch and transcripts always miss. Her eyes had the look of a woman who has just realized The witness she planned to interrogate has just become her prosecutor. There's a rhythm to a cross-examination that only trial lawyers really understand. It's not the rhythm of a conversation, which is a give and take, a back and forth, a negotiation between two voices. It's the rhythm of control. The questioner sets the tempo. The questioner chooses the direction. The questioner decides when to advance, when to pause, and when to strike. The witness isn't a partner in the conversation. The witness is the subject of it. Kash Patel understood this rhythm the same way a musician understands a time signature, not intellectually, but physically, deep in his bones, in the way his voice would rise and fall and pause and continue. He had learned it back in Miami-Dade County, defending men accused of murder, where the wrong question at the wrong moment could be the difference between freedom and a life sentence. He had refined it at the Department of Justice, prosecuting terrorists, where the right question at the right moment could unravel an entire network. And he was deploying it right now, in room 2154, against a congresswoman who was used to being the one asking the questions and was now discovering minute by minute that the rules of engagement had completely changed. Omar tried to retake the initiative. She leaned into her microphone, carrying herself like a woman who had decided to go on the offensive. Shoulders forward, chin up, her voice tuned for command. Director Patel, since you seem determined to make this hearing about me instead of the investigation you're supposed to be running, let me just address something head-on. You're the one who authored the Nunes Memo, a document that many in the intelligence community called misleading, and that was widely blasted as a partisan attack on the Russia investigation. You have a documented history of using your office to serve political agendas. So, before you question my integrity, perhaps you should take a look at your own. It was the most powerful thing she'd said all morning. It was also the worst possible move tactically, because it gave Patel the exact opening he'd been waiting to walk through. Congresswoman, thank you for bringing up the Nunes Memo. Inspector General Michael Horowitz later reviewed the FBI's FISA applications and found 17 significant errors and omissions. 17. The memo I helped write was the very thing that pointed out those abuses. The Inspector General confirmed them. I appreciate you bringing it up. He smiled. It wasn't a broad smile. It was a lawyer's smile. The kind of smile that appears when the opposing lawyer has accidentally introduced evidence that helps your case. But since you've raised the topic of public statements, I would like to discuss yours. He pulled a third folder from his briefcase. This one was thinner than the others, but he handled it with more care, the way a lawyer handles the one exhibit that will change the jury's mind about the case. November 2012. You posted on social media, and I am reading from the archived record, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Hypnotized. The word you chose was hypnotized. The tired old story of Jews controlling the world through dark powers is one of the oldest anti-Semitic lies in history. It predates the Holocaust. It was used in Nazi propaganda, and you, a member of the United States Congress, posted it on a public platform. He turned a page. February 2019. In response to a question about political support for Israel. You tweeted, and again I am quoting the public record. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. Benjamins, slang for $100 bills. The implication being that American support for Israel is simply purchased with Jewish money. The stereotype of Jews buying political influence is, again, one of the most recognized anti-Semitic smears in modern history. He turned another page. 3 weeks later, February 27, 2019. You stated publicly, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. Allegiance to a foreign country. The dual loyalty accusation. The claim that Jewish Americans are more loyal to Israel than to the United States. This lie has been used to justify the persecution of Jews for centuries. He set the pages down. 3 separate incidents, 3 separate anti-Semitic tropes. Your own party, the Democratic Party, introduced a resolution condemning your remarks. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel called your statements deeply offensive. And in February of 2023, the House of Representatives voted 218 to 211 to remove you from the Foreign Affairs Committee. He paused, and then his voice changed. For the first 40 minutes of the hearing, Patel had spoken with the controlled precision of a lawyer. His sentences were measured, his emotions contained. Every word placed with the care of a chess piece being moved across a board. Now, for the first time, something else crept into his voice. It wasn't exactly anger, but something more dangerous than anger. It was the quality of a man who has seen the thing he is about to describe, and who doesn't need fancy words to make it hit home, because the memory alone is powerful enough. Congresswoman, I want to talk about September 11th. The room grew tense. The 2 words, September 11th, carry a gravity in American public life that no other date has. They seem to bend the air around them. They change the posture of everyone who hears them. In the gallery, a woman in the 2nd row closed her eyes. A man in the 4th row put his hand on the armrest and squeezed it tight. 2,977 people died on September 11, 2001. I grew up on Long Island, New York. I could see the smoke rising from the towers. Classmates of mine lost parents that day. Friends of my family never came home. His voice was low, but not soft low. It was the voice of a man controlling something inside himself and succeeding, but just barely. I later became a terrorism prosecutor at the Department of Justice. I prosecuted individuals connected to terrorist organizations in East Africa and here in the United States. I coordinated with Special Operations Forces. I have looked into the eyes of people who wanted to kill Americans. I know what terrorism is. Not from television, not from textbooks, but from case files and courtrooms and the faces of people who had lost someone. He looked directly at Omar, his eyes locked on hers, and didn't let go. In March of 2019, you gave a speech at a Council on American Islamic Relations event. You were discussing the founding of CAIR after September 11th. And you described the worst terrorist attack in American history, the murder of 2,977 human beings, with 5 words. He paused. Some people did something. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in a quiet cathedral. Not because they were loud, but because they were so precise. Because everyone in the room had heard them before, had debated them, had either defended them or condemned them. And now, in this room, in this context, spoken by a man who had prosecuted the very kind of people who had done the something, the words sounded different. They sounded exactly as damning as they were. Some people, Congresswoman, as if 19 al-Qaeda hijackers were just some people, as if the coordinated murder of nearly 3,000 Americans was just something, as if the towers collapsing and the Pentagon burning and a field in Pennsylvania swallowing a plane full of passengers who fought back was just an event you could summarize with a shrug. His voice hardened, not louder, but harder. The hardness of iron, not of volume. I prosecuted terrorists. I built cases against people who recruited, financed, and inspired attacks on American soil. That is not something. That is war. And the people who did it are not some people. They are the enemy. He broke his gaze with hers. He took a breath. One single breath. And when he spoke again, his voice had returned to the controlled, measured tone of a lawyer, as though the emotion of the last 60 seconds had been a door he had opened, walked through, and then firmly closed behind him. You sat in the United States Congress, wearing the title that this nation gave you, drawing the salary that American taxpayers provide, protected by the Constitution that American soldiers died defending, and you trivialized the memory of 2,907 people in 5 words. He placed the folder on the stack with the others. 3 folders now, 3 counts. It was a growing architecture of documents that was, piece by piece, building something that looked less like a hearing and more like a prosecution. Patel reached for his glass of water. He drank slowly. He set it down. The act was deliberate, a courtroom trick to reset the room's focus after an emotional peak. Juries need transitions. Audiences need transitions. The pause between the emotional and the factual is what allows both to sink in. When he spoke again, his voice was ice, not cold in a theatrical way, not a villain's cold, not a politician's cold, but the operational cold of a man getting back to the job at hand after allowing himself a brief moment of humanity. Let us return to the reason we are here. Minnesota. He opened his briefcase for the 4th time, pulling out the 4th folder. This one was the thickest, dense with documents, exhibits, and charts that had been shrunk down to printed pages. Feeding Our Future, founded by Amy Bach in 2016. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the organization claimed to be distributing millions of meals to school children through the Federal Child Nutrition Program. The actual number of meals handed out was only about 3% of what was claimed. The other 97% of the money, $250 million in federal funds, was stolen. He let that number hang in the air. 200 pounds and $50 million. 78 defendants have been indicted. More than 50 have already pleaded guilty. Ms. Bach was convicted of wire fraud. The defendants spent the stolen money on lakefront properties, luxury cars, jewelry, and first-class travel. One defendant even rented a private villa in the Maldives with money that was supposed to feed children in Minneapolis. He turned a page. But feeding our future is only the beginning. Investigators have since uncovered fraud in Minnesota's autism therapy program, an estimated $220 million. And in the Housing Stabilization Services program, another $32 million. Acting United States Attorney Joseph Thompson described it as staggering industrial-scale fraud. The total estimated losses are approaching $1 billion. He looked at Omar. $1 billion, Congresswoman, stolen from programs designed to feed children, house the vulnerable, and provide therapy to kids with autism. In the state you represent, in the community you claim to champion. Omar opened her mouth to respond. Patel kept talking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speed up. He simply didn't stop. The way a river doesn't stop. The way gravity doesn't stop. The way facts, once they're all lined up, create a momentum that doesn't need any extra force. On March 11, 2020, you introduced the Meal Us Act. The bill changed the Department of Agriculture's food and nutrition programs to allow for certain waivers on the rules for school meal programs during pandemic-related school closures. The bill relaxed the oversight requirements. It expanded the pool of organizations that were eligible to receive federal nutrition funds. It created the precise conditions that Feeding Our Future took advantage of. He held up a printed page. Safari Restaurant, located in Minneapolis. Seating capacity, approximately 35 people. According to federal charging documents, Safari Restaurant claimed to be serving 18,000 meals a day. 18,000 meals from a restaurant that seats 35. He set the page down. Congresswoman, you publicly praised Safari Restaurant. The owner of Safari Restaurant is now facing federal charges for his role in the fraud. He removed another document. Your campaign received $7,400 in donations from 3 of the defendants in the Feeding Our Future case. 2 of those defendants were connected with Safari Restaurant, which allegedly received $16 million in fraudulent funds. Omar spoke. Her voice was controlled, the kind of control a politician has after practicing a response. My campaign returned those donations immediately when the FBI investigation became public. I encouraged all other officials to do the same. I have no involvement in any... Let me rephrase, Congresswoman. The phrase, "let me rephrase," landed with the sharp precision of a signature move. It was his phrase, the one he had used in courtrooms in Miami when a witness tried to dodge a question. The phrase that said, "I heard you, and now I am going to ask the real question." You returned $7,400. The fraud we are investigating is over $250 million. You returned 0.003% of what was stolen. And when Fox News asked you whether you regret the Meals Act, the bill that created the conditions for the largest pandemic fraud in American history, you said, and I am quoting, "Absolutely not." He closed the folder. Congresswoman, I have a question for you. The children that money was supposed to feed, the children in Minneapolis, in your district, who were supposed to get meals during a pandemic when schools were closed and families were struggling. Do you know their names? A pause. Or do you only know the names of the people who donated to your campaign? The gallery stirred. It wasn't applause. The chairman would have shut that down instantly. It was something quieter. The collective exhale of 300 people who had just heard the question they had all been waiting for someone to ask. Patel set the 4th folder on the stack. 4 counts. 4 folders. The briefcase was nearly empty now, with just 1 folder left, and he wasn't ready for it yet. He was ready for something else. He moved the microphone slightly closer, just an inch. The gesture was small, but it changed the sound of his voice, making it more intimate, more direct, as if he were speaking not to the room, but to one single person. This was another courtroom technique. When you want the jury to lean in, you lower your voice. When you lower your voice, the room follows. I want to tell this committee a story, he said. Not about fraud, not about politics, but about why I became a lawyer. His voice shifted. It wasn't softer or different. The lawyer's precision was still there, but underneath it was something warmer. Something that sounded, if you listened carefully, like a memory. Miami-Dade County, Florida, 2006. I was 26 years old. A public defender. The court assigned me a client, a 19-year-old kid, a Haitian immigrant, arrested for drug trafficking. Felony charge, 15 years. He paused. The kid barely spoke English. His family had no money, no connections, no fancy lawyer on retainer. The system did what the system does. It assigned him to me. A 26-year-old public defender, the son of immigrants, fresh out of law school, carrying a case file and a briefcase that looked a lot like this one. He touched the leather case, just for a moment, almost without thinking. I read the file. The evidence was weak. The witnesses contradicted each other. The chain of custody on the drugs had gaps in it. I thought this kid might be innocent. He looked at the committee, not at Omar, but at the committee, at the gallery, at the cameras. I fought for him. 6 months, 12 court appearances, motions to suppress evidence, cross-examining every single witness, and at the end of it all, an acquittal. Not guilty. His voice dropped, not to a whisper. Kash Patel didn't whisper, but to that level where truth lives, just below rhetoric, and just above silence. The kid hugged me and cried. His mother fell to her knees on the courtroom floor and thanked God. And I, an Indian-American Hindu son of immigrants who were expelled from Africa, stood in a Florida courtroom and understood something. I understood why this country is great. Not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but because here, even the poorest, most forgotten, most powerless person has the constitutional right to be defended. He let the memory settle in the room. Then he turned it. That is why I became a lawyer. That is why I joined the Department of Justice. That is why I investigated the FBI when the FBI abused its power. Because power without accountability is tyranny, whether it comes from a drug cartel or a federal agency. And that is why I sit here today. He looked at Omar directly. The distance between the witness table and the dais was maybe 12 feet. In that 12 feet, there was nothing. No barrier, no partition, no shield, just air and light and the accumulated weight of everything that had been said. Congresswoman, I spent 7 years as a public defender. I defended murderers, drug traffickers, financial criminals, people the system wanted to just throw away. I protected their constitutional rights, not because they deserved sympathy, but because they deserved the process that the Constitution guarantees. He paused for 3 seconds, just long enough for every person in the room to lean forward a fraction of an inch. And I want to tell you something about those clients. Every single one of them, the murderers, the traffickers, the con artists, every single one of them stood in front of a judge and faced the charges. They didn't call the judge a racist. They didn't accuse the prosecutor of discrimination. They didn't claim that the questions were motivated by bigotry. They stood there. They answered. They faced it. His voice hardened again. The iron was back. The warmth of the Miami story was gone, replaced by something that wasn't quite anger, but was right next to it. The cold, righteous clarity of a man who has measured the distance between honesty and dishonesty, and found it to be exactly the distance between the witness table and the dais. You have not done that, Congresswoman. For 10 years, you have been asked questions about your marriages, about your immigration records, about your finances, about your campaign spending. And for 10 years, your answer has been the same. That's a conspiracy theory. You're attacking me because I'm Muslim. This is about racism. Every question, no matter what evidence is behind it, hits the same wall. He shook his head once, slowly, the way a lawyer shakes his head during a closing argument, when the evidence has spoken and the verdict is all but certain. The killers I defended in Miami were more honest than you, Congresswoman, because at least they didn't pretend to be victims. The room didn't move. The room didn't breathe. The C-SPAN cameras, which had been switching between Patel and Omar throughout the hearing, now settled on Omar's face. Her expression was composed, the practiced composure of a politician who has been trained to keep it together under fire. But her hands, which had been resting on the dais, had moved to her lap, below the camera line, where no one could see if they were steady. Something changed in Ilhan Omar. For the first hour of the hearing, she had operated inside the framework she knew. The framework that had carried her from a refugee camp in Dadaab, Kenya, to the United States Congress. That framework had three pillars: identity, narrative, and counterattack. When criticized, you bring up identity. When questioned, you reshape the narrative. When cornered, you attack the person asking the questions. It was a framework that had worked for 8 years of her public life, through scandals and investigations and Twitter storms, and a president who had told a crowd to send her back. It had worked because it was rooted in something real. She genuinely was a refugee, a Muslim, a woman of color in a system built by and for people who did not look like her. The framework wasn't entirely cynical. It was built on genuine experience and then weaponized for political survival. But frameworks have their limits. And the limit of this one had been reached about 90 seconds ago, when a man who shared her immigration story, who was also a child of expelled refugees, who was also a person of color, who was also a religious minority, had used every piece of her framework against her and left her with nothing left to use. She sat behind her nameplate for 4 seconds. Then she spoke, and when she did something she hadn't done all morning. She abandoned the framework. Director Patel. Her voice was different, not louder, not softer, but stripped bare. The political polish had been scraped away, and what was left was raw. The voice of a woman who was no longer performing, but fighting. You sit there with your folders and your courtroom tricks and your carefully rehearsed stories about Miami. Let me tell you what I see. She leaned forward. Her hands were back on the dais now, palms down, fingers spread, the posture of someone bracing themselves. I see a man who was appointed by a president who wants revenge. I see a man who wrote children's books painting himself as a wizard protecting King Donald. I see a man who put out a list of 60 Americans he labeled government gangsters. And now he's in charge of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the nation. I see a man who spent 2 years on his podcast pushing conspiracy theories about the FBI, and now he is the FBI. Her voice grew stronger. You could hear the power in it. Real, genuine power. Genuine, the kind of power you hear from a survivor who's been backed into a corner before, but always found a way out. You want to talk about honesty? You're the one who claimed on social media that COVID vaccines' spike proteins had to be detoxified with supplement pills. You pushed claims of election fraud that have been thrown out by every single court in this country. You signed copies of your book with QAnon slogans, and yet you expect this committee to believe you're an impartial investigator? She just shook her head. You're not here to find the truth, Director. You're here to put on a show for an audience of one, and that one person lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The gallery just erupted, but not everyone was on the same page. The left side of the room exploded into applause. The right side sat there in stony silence, while the press in the center scribbled away furiously. The chairman banged his gavel 3 times. Order was restored, but the energy in the room had already fractured, splitting right along the same fault lines that divide the country. And in that fracture, both sides found exactly what they came for: confirmation that they were the ones who were right. Patel didn't react. He didn't flinch at the applause. He didn't bristle at the accusations. He just sat there at the witness table, hands flat, expression unchanged, like a trial lawyer watching the opposing counsel give a passionate closing argument that sounds great, but doesn't actually touch the evidence. He waited. The room settled down. He said, "Congresswoman, thank you. You've just proved my point." He raised one hand, not for drama, but for function, like a man about to count on his fingers. I asked you about Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi. You didn't answer. One finger up. I asked you about the $2,780,000 that went to your husband's firm. You didn't answer. Two fingers. I asked you about the jump from $158,000 to $30 million in a single year. You didn't answer. 3. I asked you about your "some people did something" comment. You didn't answer. 4. I asked you about the Safari restaurant. 35 seats, yet serving 18,000 meals a day. You didn't answer. 5. I asked you about the 740 from convicted fraudsters. You claimed you returned it. But you never addressed the underlying question. He lowered his hand. 6 questions, Congresswoman. 6 factual questions, every one of them based on public records, court documents, financial disclosures, and your own words. And instead of answering a single one, you attacked me. My appointment, my books, my background, my relationship with the president. He leaned forward, just slightly. The space between them shrank by an inch, and in the geometry of a hearing room, that's the difference between professional and personal. That is the oldest trick in the criminal defense playbook. I know it. I've used it myself. When the evidence against your client is overwhelming, you don't argue the evidence. You attack the credibility of the prosecution. You make the trial about the prosecutor instead of the defendant. He straightened back up. But this isn't a courtroom in Miami, Congresswoman. This is a hearing room in the United States Capitol. And the jury isn't 12 citizens in a box. The jury is 330 million Americans, watching on C-SPAN, reading on their phones, listening in their cars. He placed both hands flat on the table again, the same posture he started with, the public defender's stance, hands visible, nothing to hide. I have defended the accused. I have prosecuted terrorists. I've investigated the FBI when the FBI itself broke the rules. And now I lead the FBI. At every single stage, from Miami to the Department of Justice, to Capitol Hill, to the Hoover Building, I have done the exact same thing. I have followed the evidence. His voice dropped to its final register, low, clear, and unadorned. It was the voice of a closing argument that needs no extra flair, because the facts have already done all the heavy lifting. The evidence, Congresswoman, doesn't care about your identity. It doesn't care about mine. It doesn't care about party affiliation or cable news coverage or social media followers. The evidence is what it is. And when this investigation is complete, the evidence will speak for itself, not in headlines, not in press releases, not in hashtags, but in courtrooms, under oath, where the truth actually has consequences. He closed his briefcase. The brass clasp clicked shut with a sound that was small, specific, and final. This investigation will continue. The questions I asked you today will be answered, not by me, not by you, but by the evidence. And unlike you, Congresswoman, the evidence doesn't hide behind accusations of racism when someone asks it a question. The chairman cleared his throat. Director Patel, I believe this concludes the committee's first round. We will now recess for 15 minutes before we begin the second round of questions. The chair thanks the director for his testimony. Patel nodded. He stood up. He picked up his briefcase, which was lighter now, its folders emptied, their contents spread across the witness table like exhibits in a trial that hadn't reached a verdict yet, but whose direction was clear. He walked toward the door. His stride was even and unhurried. It was the stride of a lawyer leaving a courtroom after a long day of testimony, knowing the case isn't over, that there will be more hearings, more questions, and more documents, but also knowing that the trajectory has been set, that evidence, once presented, can't be unpresented, and that a truth, once spoken in a room full of cameras, exists forever in the public record. He didn't look back. The door closed behind him with the sound of that briefcase clasp, small, specific, and final. That evening, there were two families and two silences. In an apartment on Capitol Hill, Ilhan Omar sat with three of her staffers around a dining table covered in laptops and phones. The television was on mute, with closed captions scrolling across the screen. The chyron reading, "Patel confronts Omar. FBI director raises marriage fraud and financial questions at oversight hearing." A second chyron appeared on a different network. Omar fires back. He is here to perform for an audience of one. Her press secretary was in the middle of drafting a statement. The statement used the words "politically motivated racist attacks" and "continued targeting of a black Muslim woman." It was the same framework every previous statement had used because that framework worked. Not on everyone, not on the people who had watched the entire hearing, but on enough people. The base, the donors, the whole ecosystem of progressive media that would amplify the message and completely reframe the narrative by morning. Omar read the statement. She picked up a pen to sign it. But then she paused. Through the apartment window, Washington was doing what it does at night. It was glowing. The Capitol dome, lit from below, floated against the dark sky like a lantern. The monuments, the memorials, the stone and marble architecture representing a nation's idea of itself. All of it was visible from the window of a woman who had come to this country as a 12-year-old refugee from a camp in Kenya. A girl who spoke no English, who sat in a Virginia classroom and learned the Pledge of Allegiance phonetically before she even understood what the words meant. She remembered the camp, not the details, because those had faded like most childhood memories do, into impressions rather than clear images. But she remembered the feeling, that feeling of waiting, of not knowing if a future even existed, or if the present was all there would ever be. She remembered the day her father told her they were going to America. She remembered the plane. She remembered the cold of a Minneapolis winter, after a lifetime in the East African heat. That cold felt like a wall she had just walked straight into. America had given her everything: citizenship, an education, a seat in the state legislature, a seat in Congress, the covers of magazines, the attention of presidents, everything. She looked down at the statement. Politically motivated, racist attacks, continued targeting. For just a moment, a brief, private moment visible to no one, something crossed her face. Not guilt, but something that comes before guilt. It was the faintest shadow of a question. Had she earned what this country gave her, or had she just used it? The moment passed. She signed the statement. She handed it to her press secretary. "Send it." In Garden City, Long Island, in a modest house on a quiet street, the kind of street where the lawns are kept up but not perfectly manicured, where the cars are clean but not brand new, where the American dream lives in its most ordinary and therefore its most honest form. Pramod Patel sat in a recliner in front of a television. He was 75 years old. His hair was white. His hands, the hands that had built a career in aviation finance after coming to America with nothing, rested on the arms of the chair with the kind of stillness that comes from learning over a long life. That stillness isn't the same as inaction. Sometimes stillness is the deepest form of action. Sometimes stillness is how you hold both the past and the present in the same moment, without letting either one break. His wife brought him some tea. She set it on the side table. She sat on the couch next to his chair. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They had been married for 48 years, and the language between them had long ago moved beyond words. On the television, a replay of the hearing was on. Their son, Kashyap Kash, the boy they had raised on this very street, who had ridden his bicycle on this sidewalk, who had studied criminal justice at the University of Richmond and law at Pace University and international law in London. Their son was sitting at a witness table in the United States Capitol and saying, "In America, even the poorest, most forgotten, most powerless person has the constitutional right to be defended." Pramod didn't move. His wife wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He remembered Uganda, but not the good years. There had been good years, years when the Indian community in Kampala had been prosperous and settled, secure in the belief that Africa was their home. He remembered the end of those good years. He remembered 1972. He remembered Idi Amin's voice on the radio, announcing that all people of Asian origin had 90 days to leave the country. He remembered the panic, the neighbors loading up trucks in the middle of the night, the businesses being seized, the soldiers at the checkpoints. He remembered standing in an airport with his wife and their belongings. Not suitcases, because there hadn't been time for suitcases, just cloth bags holding whatever they could carry. He remembered the plane. He remembered looking down at the African continent through the window, understanding, with the kind of certainty that only loss can bring, that he would never go back, that everything he had built was now gone, that the future was a country he had never even visited, a language he spoke imperfectly, and a hope that had no evidence to support it, other than the stories he'd heard about a place called America, where they said a person could start over. On the television, his son closed a briefcase, stood up, and walked out of a hearing room. Pramod reached for his tea. He took a sip. He set the cup back down. When he spoke, it was the first thing he had said in over an hour, and he said it quietly to his wife in Gujarati, the language of their village in the Anand district, the language that had survived Uganda, and survived the flight, and survived Long Island, and survived 48 years of American life. He said, he did it the right way. His wife nodded. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew he meant everything. He meant the career, and the testimony, and the words he spoke in a room full of cameras. But mostly, he meant the thing that lies underneath it all, the thing that doesn't show up in transcripts or on chyrons or in press releases, the thing that a father who has lost everything can recognize in a son who has earned everything: integrity, the kind that isn't performed but lived, the kind that begins in a courtroom in Miami and ends in a hearing room in Washington, and in between belongs to a family that arrived with nothing and built something real. In Cedar Riverside, the Minneapolis neighborhood known as Little Mogadishu, where the storefronts advertise in Somali, and the call to prayer drifts from the Dar al-Hijra Mosque, and the apartment towers rise against the Minnesota sky like monuments to a community that has built a life so far from home. A young mother turned off the television. Her son, 6 years old, born in Minneapolis, American by birth and Somali by heritage, had been watching over her shoulder. He hadn't understood the hearing. He was only 6, and the hearing was full of words and ideas that were way beyond him. But he had seen 2 faces on the screen, and he recognized one of them, because her face was on posters in the hallways of his apartment building and in the window of the coffee shop on the corner. "Mama," he said, "did Miss Omar do something wrong?" The mother didn't answer right away. She looked up at the wall above the television, where 2 things were hanging in frames. The first was a photograph, a family photo taken in the lobby of the Minneapolis Convention Center on the day she became a citizen. Her hand was raised, Her eyes were bright, and the flag was right behind her. The second was the certificate itself, the piece of paper that said she was American, signed, sealed, and real. She looked at her son. "Being American," she said, "is not something you just take. It's something you have to earn every single day." The boy nodded the way 6-year-olds do, solemnly, without fully understanding, but with the gut feeling that what she just said was important. She turned off the light. Outside, the Minneapolis night settled over Cedar Riverside, cold and clear. The kind of January night when you can see the stars even through the city lights, and the breath of anyone who steps outside forms a small cloud that rises and then just vanishes. The way all things rise and all things vanish.